Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Facebook Live broadcast. I'm Steve Altition, Director of Client Partnerships here at Pacific Cascade Legal. And today I'm with our founding attorney, Louis Landerholm, to talk about why do I have to obey our divorce decree when my ex-spouse doesn't obey it. So, Louis, how you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing well. How are you, Steve?
I'm doing well. I'm kind of excited about this one. I hear it a lot. you know, they're doing it, they're doing this, they're doing that. Why can't I do the same thing? So I thought before we kind of got into that, let's just talk a little bit about the basics of what a divorce decree is and what it means.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's something that is very commonly misunderstood. In a divorce proceeding, I can sort of go back to the building blocks of, what a divorce decree or judgment. In Oregon, we typically use judgment for the document itself, but decree is a common word used for it as well. Um, Basically what happens is, when you file your divorce and you get to the end, either a judge is going to decide in a traditional trial or hearing, or the parties are going to agree and settle. The final document that comes out of that is the judgment. And that's what will be signed by the judge. And that becomes the enforceable order. That document becomes the final resolution that then can be enforced either from a money standpoint or from like a parenting plan standpoint. So that's the document that really matters. And that if there's if there's a misunderstanding, or if there's future litigation, that's what the judge is going to go back to determine what was actually ordered at the time of the divorce.
And that decree, isn't that enforceable by the judge? Pretty much just by the judge. We can't just go out and enforce it ourselves.
Right. Yeah. Basically, depending on which pieces need to be enforced, and that could be a whole nother subject, of course, but because there's what do I do if I need to enforce money part of things? And generally, money is going to fall under a contempt, type. People hear of contempt, and contempt is somebody not, they're willfully violating the judgment. There's also enforcement, and this is where it gets detailed and intricate based off of what actually the violation is. And then there's like a parenting time enforcement. So there's a number of different things, but basically the underlying component is the judgment says that one of the parties is supposed to do something. That party hasn't done it. Either they can't or they won't. And then there's different procedural options to determine what to do about
Despite all that, despite the fact that it's written down, it is pretty clear. It kind of says what you can, what you can't do, and then who is going to enforce it. Yet the spouses want to sort of take the time to enforce it themselves, and they do it in all kinds of goofy ways. And that's kind of what we want to talk about is, just the concept. I guess I'm correct, is that just because your spouse doesn't obey it doesn't mean you don't have to obey
it.
it. And so I kind of got a couple of different scenarios and just want to talk about, the worst ones that seem to appear. Maybe you can talk about how those work. And the one that we see is withholding parenting time for unpaid child support.
Right.
Can you do that?
No. You're not supposed to.
Yeah.
Basically, yeah, not paying child support is not a reason to withhold parenting time. It's not a valid reason. They're two separate things. If somebody's not paying child support, like sort of what I referred to, just a couple minutes ago, is if it's a money thing, we have to do something different than if it's a withholding, a parenting time component. So, the self-help measure essentially is what you're talking about is, oh, my ex-spouse decided not to pay me child support. So my remedy to getting them to pay child support is to withhold the kids. That's not the way that the judgment works because they live independently of themselves. If you need to enforce the child support, we need to enforce the child support in a different way, either through, a state action, depending on, how that's all set up. Sometimes it's not through the state. Sometimes it's just, directly through the parties. But there are, civil remedies to go after the child support. But if you then go and withhold the kids, now you're in violation of the judgment yourself. And so then your ex-spouse has an enforcement provision that then can come after you for withholding the kids. So you end up compounding the problem because now you've got an enforcement hearing that's going to happen faster than the child support hearing because they're two different pieces. And so it just makes a situation that's already a frustrating one explode into a much more frustrating situation. And you can be found in violation for withholding, the kids from the judgment and then not have anything happen on the child support. If you don't, then go and enforce the child support the right way.
Yeah, and it feels like, and in a lot of these cases, I'm sure you've got so many stories, how the kids get caught in the middle of all this stuff. But in this case, it seems like child support is for the kids' benefit. Parenting time is for the kids' benefit. And so you're sort of saying, well, you're doing a bad thing for my children, so I'm going to do a bad thing for my children. That just doesn't make any sense.
Right. Yeah. And this is why judges, pull their hair out at times because they get people, in front of them and say, "What? But judge, they didn't pay the child support," and the judge is like, "Yeah, but that's not the right way to deal with it." And so we have to do it the right way.
It feels, you got to go in clean to one of these, an enforcement order. You can't go in that you've got a litany of things that you haven't done as well.
Right. Yeah. Because then if you're not, if you're taking those measures yourself, you're going to appear unreasonable, even though logically it can make sense. The law is very technical and very procedural. And so logic doesn't necessarily apply the same way. Like the only way you can deviate from the parenting plan, and it's written into, I would say 95% of parenting plans, is that it's only by agreement of the parties or by a further order of the court. And even if it's agreed upon by the parties, the only enforceable language is the language in the parenting plan. So it could go on, we've got clients who, maybe they got divorced when their kids were, 3 and 5. And they had a parenting plan for young kids that is outdated. And over the course of time, maybe it said every other weekend back then, or it said, 2 days a week plus an off, or every other week, and then like an off week visit. Well, as kids get older, lives change, people, move within, certain areas, and parties tend to, just deal with those changes on their own, and they come up with an agreement that works for them, and that's all perfectly fine. But then, say something happens, like say child support doesn't get paid. What can happen, as opposed to withholding, one parent can say, well, you have to live by this old parenting plan because that's what the plan says. So now one parent may have had, week on, week off, because that's been, happening for the last few years. And then, the other parent who has more of the time says, well, now I'm reverting to that. We're going back to the old parenting plan. And so now you're dealing with that also. So that's a component of like, situations where you can't, I mean, even if you enforce the old judgment, it's just going to give you what it originally was, written. And so that's why all of this stuff is important as things go along, that, just understanding how the judgment works and what's enforceable, what's not enforceable comes into play so many times.
Yeah. And I get people when they're frustrated and they want to do something, and so they're going to try to find a reason. And the reason, spousal, or excuse me, child support and parenting time seem like, oh yeah, that's not a good idea because the kids are involved. They'll turn to like, withholding parenting time for failure to pay spousal support, which on the, is that a difference, or is that a difference without a difference?
Yeah, I mean, as far as the way that the courts look at it, it's, really no different. Basically any withholding basically doing anything in violation of the judgment is a violation of the judgment. It doesn't matter what you're doing. If one party is failing to pay spousal, well, there's a remedy for that, and that's filing to enforce the spousal support. The remedy isn't then to withhold the kids or not comply with the judgment in any way. Like, we see other instances where, say, one party is ordered to pay child support, right, or spousal support, and the other party was ordered to pay certain debts from, the judgment. You can't then stop paying those debts because the other party's not paying spousal support. Like, right. You have to, like, those things are completely separate issues, and you have to deal with them independently, even though they could be tied very closely together. So the reaction from one spouse to do something that's in violation of the judgment becomes the same problem that the other spouse was doing by failing to comply. And it can be an extremely frustrating situation.
And that the flip side really is the same issues, isn't it? I mean, you could turn around and say, well, okay, I'm going to stop paying child support because you're violating my parenting rights.
Right. Yeah.
Either same issues hold.
Yeah. Either basically, all of the above. We've seen it a million times, and they all become, interwoven issues, but ultimately all the judge is going to do is go back to the initial document and say, what was ordered to be done, who's doing it, who's not, and is there a valid reason for it? And if there's not a valid reason for it, then, everybody could be found in violation of the judgment.
Here's a little more nuanced one. And I think this one, I don't know if it has the same answer or not. One parent is violating the parenting plan by always showing up late, or not calling, or not making some of the things that they need to do in the actual parenting time, in the actual parenting plan. And the other parent says, well, if you're not here at 4:59, then you don't get them. And that may not be reasonable, but is there some sort of difference in terms of trying to self-regulate the parenting plan when it's sort of those kinds of things?
Yeah, those are the ones that are probably the most complicated. The other piece of that is, say you've got a parent who is ordered time, and they are ordered a certain amount of parenting time. One parent has 3 days a week, but consistently are only taking 2 days a week. So they're basically giving up a day of their parenting time. That's different typically in the way that it is dealt with, because the normally judges aren't forcing that parent to then go and exercise their time. And then in language issues, like what you're talking about on the late side of things, if your judgment is silent, which the vast majority of parenting plans, when people are trying to figure this out on their own, and you've written your own judgment, it's on the state forms and submitted, this is a component of people don't do this every day, and so they don't know what to include, what not to include. And so a provision that's late, like constantly showing up late, if it doesn't define what late is, then you can't really find them in violation of the judgment. It's not a reason to potentially not give parenting time. The actual remedy in that situation typically is that the parenting plan needs to be modified because there's a problem with the parenting plan, not that somebody is in clear violation of the parenting plan. And so that's where at the very beginning of trying to build parenting plans, and when we're building parenting plans, people are always like, why does it have to be so detailed, right? I mean, because when we define who's doing drop off, who's taking the kids, who's picking up the kids. What does late mean? Are we talking about if you're 15 minutes late, then you forfeit your parenting time? If you're a half an hour late, do you forfeit? Does late not matter? All of these things come into play during the negotiations of a parenting plan, because ultimately, in either an enforcement action or in a modification action down the road, the judge is going to go back and look at that original document to determine what was ordered at that time. And that creates a whole lot of litigation and a whole lot of extra work and time and money on people's plates, because it wasn't as clear as everybody wanted it to be. Or the other one is a silent verbal agreement, that, oh yeah, we verbally agreed to do this, it's not in the judgment. If it's not in the judgment, it's not enforceable. And so that happens all the time too, where people are like, oh yeah, I was told I could have this extra, say Sunday night to Monday morning, but I'm not getting that. Well, if it's not written into the judgment, you can't do anything about it other than filing to modify the judgment.
If you don't have a good foundation, like a good judgment feels like, then you're starting off on a bad foot, because you're almost destined to have issues. And one of the things that I really think is coming to you is that you've seen these things happen over and over and over, and anticipate them so you can put them in the judgment, where people who kind of do it on their own or just want a quickie divorce don't even know what they don't know.
Yeah, it's a common, something that I talk to people all day long, is, when you're trying to handle your own divorce, you have the internet to go to, you have your friends who have been through it once, twice, and you talk to people in the world, and they're trying to apply their knowledge to the facts. The problem is that's a very limited sort of universe, right? And it doesn't apply to your facts directly. The reason that we get involved, and really the way that our sort of role comes into play in a lot of these cases, is that we've handled thousands of divorces, and we're in front of judges all day long. And so what we can do is we take the set of facts that, a potential client or a client has, and we're able to apply the experience of those thousands of cases to their set of facts to be able to foresee where the problem is. We try to build parenting plans to try to at least get, depending on the age of the kids, but typically 5 years into the future, right? We want to, if kids aren't in school yet, well, let's plan for school. How are we going to deal with summers? How are we going to deal with summer camps? How are we going to deal with, vacations? How are we going to deal with all of these things that may not be relevant, at the time, but they become relevant later. And so we want to have a lasting, parenting plan as much as possible. There's moves will, always throw things for, a loop because things inevitably have to change. But the goal is really to look into the future as much as possible to plan for, family changes that are inevitably going to happen.
Yeah. You talk about enforcement, and it really is technically an issue for the court to decide, but there's people that just because they shouldn't deny parenting time or shouldn't pay support it because their other side is doing something. There are things they can do because they can, I'm just thinking things like document these things happen, because inevitably, if it comes to support, it's going to be I said, you said thing if you don't.
Well, yeah. And then when it becomes, and the other big one is in a lot of judgments, it says uninsured medical will be split 50-50, or it will say that activity fees are split 50-50. And if you can't prove that somebody didn't pay those things, you can't get a judge to enforce it and actually say how much the other side is supposed to pay. So the accounting becomes really important. Child support's a little bit easier if it's being, if it's being collected by the state because you've got your account and all of that. But we see it a lot with the uninsureds and activity fees, especially around like orthodontia and, say like a mental health, where the numbers can get large enough pretty quickly where it makes sense to go do something about. But the really record keeping and, and making sure that everybody has an accounting of what was paid, what wasn't paid, because, anytime you go to court, it's going to cost money. Most of the time judgments say you're going to get your fees if you have to go enforce these things. And so, there's definitely a lot of, enforcement and litigation that comes from those, those type of issues. And so, that's where we want to make sure that it's very clear on how all of that's going to work in the original judgment.
Yeah. And that brings up one thing I didn't mention, we didn't talk about, is something like, hey, there's this orthodontist bill. You're supposed to pay half of it. Until you pay half of it, no parenting time. You
right.
Really can't do that either.
Right. It's the same analysis. And it's really frustrating when the orthodontic, company says, oh, by the way, and your kids can't keep going on with their braces because the other side hasn't paid their half. And so then you're stuck and you've got to pay your half. But, the reaction isn't, I can go take away parenting time. The reaction needs to be, I need to go to court and enforce that. So the takeaway for sure is that the tit for tat, you did something in violation doesn't give me the right to go do something in violation. We have to either get on the same page where we can agree, or we need to go back to court to enforce it, and then go either collect the fees or hold somebody responsible for withholding parenting time.
It's like, two wrongs don't make a right. It's just kind of the bottom line when it comes to that. Wow, we're going to do a whole set of podcasts and conversations about a lot of the stuff we touched today. Enforcement, how enforcement works, what you can and can't do, just going forward, and what the parenting plan really is. So I just encourage people to stay tuned, because we're going to have a lot of that, and a lot of broken down into very specific topics, which are going to be very helpful. But now we're out of time, as usual. So, Lewis, thanks for joining us today. Talk about why you actually do have to obey the divorce decree, even if the ex-spouse doesn't. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve.
You got it. And everyone, thank you for joining us. Anyone has any further questions, please feel free to contact our firm. We can get you connected with an attorney who can help you. And until